Hello my friends, this is a test video for the show What the Heck Is for the Board Game Trading and Chat UK TV channel. My name's Stuart Watt, and today the question I'm going to look to try and answer for people is what the heck is wargaming? So wargaming means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, I think. I think largely a very popular image of wargaming will relate to Warhammer. I think that's the high street kind of standard understanding of what wargaming is, and very popular. A lot of people enjoy it. It's based in a science fiction or a fantasy universe. There's two kind of streams, and the whole game is around collecting little models, painting the figures, learning the lore, making lore L-O-R-E, not L-A-W. So the background of the stories of all the races that Games Workshop lavishly colour in and make available for people to access. Then painting the miniatures has become almost a hobby of its own right. And then playing the games, which is again an interesting undertaking. Lots of rules to learn, lots of specifics about different races. So you've got lots of different Space Orcs and Space Marines, Imperial Guard and Eldar and all sorts of other wonderful science fiction characters. Or in the fantasy realms, you've got orcs and humans and dwarves and elves and dark elves and the Chaos Warriors and all these other wonderful things. And they all have a lot of lore behind them, a lot of history. I remember the first time I played Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and it wasn't even Fantasy Battle then, it was first edition. Must have been about 25 years ago, and even then the lore had started to be built. A lot of it's derived from kind of Tolkien history, or Tolkien mythology rather, from actual mythology. A lot of the characters are in there, and then the science fiction universe takes some of that ideas and then adds a kind of like a science fiction edge to it, which has got components that have kind of been borrowed from a lot of popular sci-fi franchises. So there's a bit of Terminator in there, there's a bit of Aliens in there. So that's kind of Warhammer, and I think that's the core of people's general experience of wargaming. But there is a lot more to it as well. So wargaming precedes Warhammer by quite a long way. My background actually after my first encounter with Warhammer became very much involved in historical wargaming, and I became very interested. History's always been something I've been very interested in anyway. So we played in my youth a lot of games using a set of rules called War Games Research Group, 6th and 7th edition, playing with 15mm painted miniatures, and again lots of instead of lore, history. So the armies that I played, I knew the history of, I knew the generals, I knew the nations that they were, and that was kind of a real passion for me as well. Again, painting figures, collecting figures, having boxes of bloody figures everywhere, and then terrain and everything as well. That's very much still a part of what I'm interested in. I still play historical wargaming. My first love was classical history. So Romans and Macedonians and Persians and all those other kind of wonderful races that or wonderful civilizations that we look back to in some awe. But I also am very interested now in lots of more contemporary stuff, not contemporary as in modern warfare stuff, but stuff certainly much newer. So I became very interested in the 30 Years' War, for example. And for me, I find it an interesting extension of my interest in history. So that's kind of where I'm at with those sort of games. I also play currently quite a lot of, well, I say quite a lot, not at the moment under quarantine, but ordinarily we quite regularly play Bolt Action, which is a World War II game, 28mm figures, and that's a really good fun game, quite light. It allows you to kind of build the army, build an army based on kind of what you want, and you can have a game in about 2 or 3 hours. It's quite a fun system. There's a sister system to this called the Beyond the Gates of Antares, which I also really enjoy playing. That's actually a sci-fi war game. Both of those use a dice drawing mechanism. So instead of an I go, you go, which is a traditional war game kind of format where somebody does all of their stuff and then the person on the other side of the table then does all of their stuff, you draw coloured dice from a bag, and that determines who gets to act next. And when you get to act, you get to move one of your units or do something with one of your units in your force. And then when the dice in the bag run out, then that's the end of the turn. You start again, you reload the dice, and then you go again. So it's quite an interesting variation on it. There's another game that I enjoy playing called Kings of War. Now, Kings of War is by a company called Mantic, and that came out about 10 years ago, I think. And that takes the big fancy battle thing and does it slightly differently. So with Warhammer, there was always lots of kind of taking figures off of the board and stuff like that. With Kings of War, instead of having individually based figures, you have blocks of figures based together to form kind of units, and they have attrition applied to them, and it has a different. It works in a different way. It's a kind of like a broader view. It's less detailed, less bogged down in specific rules about, oh, this is the left-handed goblins, so they've got this rule. These are the extra tool orcs, so they've got that rule. The units are slightly more generic. They do have special rules, but the game's designed to flow much quicker. That's quite good fun. There's lots of other games as well that are available that kind of fall into the wargaming with miniatures category. Erwin, which is a Rick Priestley game. Rick Priestley is one of the kind of like the founding fathers of fancy wargaming. He wrote a game that rule set. That's a fun kind of skirmish level game, quite similar to actually Bolt Action and Beyond the Gates of Antares. So it's a similar sort of system. He wrote both of those rule sets as well. Was involved in writing both of those rule sets. So that's really good fun. And then if the historical stuff is of interest to you, contemporary stuff now that people play quite a lot. Fields of Glory is very popular. L'Art de Guerre is also very popular. And there are any number of rule sets now with historical with science fiction and fantasy wargaming. Oftentimes you will have a starter set, a box set of figures and rules, the core basic rules, and maybe some cardboard terrain and stuff like that. With the fantasy stuff, that is quite normal. With sci-fi stuff, that's quite normal. With historical stuff, it's not. What you would tend to do is you'd buy the rules. Then from the rules, you'd decide which army you wanted to play, and then you'd start collecting those figures from the whichever range of manufacturers, which there are any number of, that you want to do to fulfill your army lists, as it were. I think the exception there is probably Bolt Action with Warlord, and I think North Star Games also do some box sets to support various different rule sets, but ordinarily you'd buy them individually. So that's kind of wargaming. The pluses of wargaming, for me, painting figures, not so much of a plus now. My eyesight's a bit knackered and I find that quite difficult, and that's quite frustrating. But the beautiful paintwork that I've seen on some figures is unbelievable, and actually the sumptuous visual spectacle of a war game in action is really quite a thing to behold. I mean, that was certainly the first thing that hooked me on day one when I first saw Warhammer, and that was a tie-dyed bed sheet with some railway terrain and some books underneath it to make hills, and then with little units of figures on it. But it just, I don't know, it just triggered something in my imagination. What else do I enjoy? I love the social element of it. So I've got a lot of friends that play this, and I've become really good friends with a lot of people through this as a hobby. So that's really good fun. I love the planning and the logistics of actually getting two people in the same place with the table big enough to play the game, with all the terrain, with all the figures and everything. That's actually quite fun. I know it sounds silly, but actually it's fun. It means you're kind of making a commitment with a friend to go and do something, and I quite enjoy that. I'm quite lucky. I've got a local friend who has a hut in his back garden, a big garden kind of house, and we quite regularly game there out of quarantine, and I'm lucky to be surrounded by quite a few people who play. So sometimes I don't have to take figures. Sometimes I'll use somebody else's figures. So it's all good fun. Reading the rules is good fun for me. For the fancy stuff, reading and understanding the lore is also interesting. Understanding kind of like the stories that have been written behind it. And for the historical stuff, again, absolutely love reading the history. Reading the history. I became completely obsessed with a Persian empire called the Sassanian Empire. So much so that actually at one point I was thinking I might go to university and do a degree to study it. I've just become absolutely obsessed with it for several years. Fortunately, I didn't do it. Family commitments meant that it just wasn't possible. But it was something that really heavily sat in my head, and it really again triggered my imagination. So I love, with historical stuff, doing the research, understanding kind of what these people were like, what they did, making sure that you paint them in a representative way so they actually kind of look like maybe they did in history. Obviously, with modern stuff, that's much more easy. In theory, certainly, like if you were looking at World War II, it's easy to find reference material to understand what they look like. But if you've ever tried painting P. camo on your German SS troopers, that is not easy. So yeah, learning the skills of painting is a real fun challenge as well. So that's my thoughts on tabletop miniature based wargaming. Now there are other sort of avenues of wargaming as well. So Avalon Hill, back in my childhood, used to make a numerous number of board games. Which were war games, and they were war games emulations of great battles like Waterloo, Austerlitz, and various, and then lots of naval games as well. So these were all kind of card chits that you cut out or you'd punch out of punch boards, and you'd have hundreds of little cardboard cubes or squares which had information about the unit they represented, and you'd play games that could last weeks and weeks if you didn't have enough time to finish them out. They could really, they really ran and ran. You'd spend a lot of time playing these games. They still endured, and I think people still do play them. It's not something that I have in my collection currently, but I certainly would love to try those again. But they've been kind of replaced with block war games as far as my experience is. Now, block war games are they're quite similar, but instead of being lots and lots of little cardboard chits, they're actually they're small wooden blocks. So it's kind of it's a bit more tactile, a little bit more robust, a little bit less prone to accidentally knocking the board and completely ruining 6 evenings worth of gameplay because you've accidentally knocked all the chits all over the place. So some really popular ones. Well, I think the one that I can think of that generally people speak of in hushed tones is Hammer of the Scots, which I've been very happy to acquire a copy of during the Kickstarter. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to play it yet because coronavirus locked me down before I managed to arrive at an arrangement to actually play that game. But there are lots of companies that do this. GMT do a few block war games, and I've completely forgotten what the company that Columbia Games, I think, did Hammer of the Scots. They also specialise in doing block war games as well. So the advantage of those is you don't have the logistics of painting figures and all this stuff that's associated with a traditional miniature-based war game. Instead, you get to be immersed in the actual actions of the game. Miniature-based war games tend to be dice-based. There's a lot of random decisions. Block-based war games tend to be slightly more deterministic. So it's the random is less of a factor, and the kind of the relative stats of the things is much more important. With miniature wargaming, there's always a joke about buckets of dice, and actually buckets of dice is a major component of it, and that's how the random events are applied to those games. But actually, with block wargaming, it's very much more right. Okay, this unit is a level 8. This unit is a level 7. So therefore, the unit that is a level 8 beats the unit that is a level 7. It's much more kind of cut and dried in that way. So it depends whether you like random or not. If you like deterministic games, then maybe block wargaming is more your thing. There are lots of games that fall into that category. There's another Command and Conquer, which is a hex-based block war game, which they cover various different periods in history with. Also good fun. Again, board games versus war games. The advantage of a board game is you stick it all in a box and you can carry it around nice and easily. Whereas a kind of a miniature-based war game, you've got the terrain, you've got the right-sized boards, you've got terrain mats, you've got boxes and boxes of figures that cost a fortune. You've got all that time that you have to put into painting them, and you're reliant on other people having the same level of commitment as well. Whereas the advantage of a box-based game or a box-based board game is you just buy the game and then you can play it. Inane ramblings over. Hopefully that kind of reverberated with people. Be really interested to hear what people think. If anybody has got any contrary opinions to me, I'd love to talk about it. If anybody's got any particular favourites from any of the kind of wargaming genres, I'd be really interested to know about them. I'm definitely keen to play games. I am a bit of an omni gamer in so much as I'll play pretty much anything with pretty much anyone, as long as you observe the first rule of the group. Please let me know your thoughts. I hope this has been interesting, and I will look to put something else together on a different subject. Thank you very much. Speak to you soon. Bye bye.